And we're live. It is Tuesday, February 25th, the year of our Lord 2025, or the year of some of our Lords 2025. It is 8 o'clock a.m. in Washington, D.C., and in the rural Ontario hamlet in which Alicia is holed up waiting for the American invaders. It is more interestingly 5 a.m. in at the University of California, Irvine, where our guest Kate Sweeny has heroically rousted herself from bed to join us, and we are in awe of that dedication because nobody has ever done that before, to be a guest on In Lieu of Fun. But I want to talk this morning, before we turn to our guest, about Alicia's mug this morning. And you got to hold it up the right way, and you got to hold it up close to the screen, because Alicia is attempting to taunt our president, and that's our president here, with War of 1812 stuff. And for those who want to uh, need a briefing on the War of 1812. Um, this is one of those wars that we often forget in American history because, the White House got sacked and burned, and the president had to flee to a little house in Brookville, Maryland, and the hamlet of Brookville, Maryland, which is about a 45-minute drive from my house, has a little sign that it was capital of the United States for one day in 1813. Um, uh, the War of 1812, Canadians like to say that they defeated us in the War of 1812. The story is a little bit more complicated than that because, actually the United States got everything it wanted out of the war except for one thing, which was Canada. But that whole freedom of navigation stuff, stop impressing our soldiers, we got it from the British. We eventually got it from the French. And so, best way to think about the War of 1812 is that it's foundational to the creation of Canada because we didn't take them over. But other than Canada, the United States actually did pretty well, considering that we wantonly declared war on the world's most powerful country, which was not Canada, actually. It was the United Kingdom. And here is a little known fact about the War of 1812, which is that President James Madison, great American, great leader, great thinker, kind of a shitty president, um, uh, when he went to Congress and asked for the declaration of war against Great Britain, which is, that was kind of like a mouse roaring. I mean, we had like 70 ships and they had 1,000 ships. It was completely crazy for the United States to declare war against Britain, and to try to take Britain's remaining colony in the New World, which was, of course, what we now call Canada, and what was then really just a kind of a bunch of us who had bunch of loyalists who had not yet. You're muted, Alicia. We can't hear you
It's
protest
probably
against
a
this
good thing because
monologue.
I've interrupted a couple of times. It was Lower and Upper Canada. Canada was in the name.
Yeah, Canada was in the name, but it was kind of like the Canada, right? The Lower Canada, the Upper Canada, kind of like, the Ukraine or the Argentine. Um, was Canada an independent country then, Alicia? Was
That's
Upper was
no.
Canada was Upper Canada an independent
We
country?
became an independent country in 1867.
Yeah. See, so Canada was at the time what one might call a province, or a colony. And by the way, most people there spoke French, except for the people who had fled from the United States. So it was kind of a bunch of, Evgomons and traders. And um
This
uh
like okay.
and hang on, um there's a very important pro Canada ending to this. Um you know, the United States had two major objectives in that war, and when it declared war on Britain, the world's greatest power, Madison also wanted to declare war concurrently on France in a fashion that was truly deranged, and he was talked out of it and asked for only a declaration of war against Canada, the United Kingdom. And so the United States had like basically three major grievances. One was the interdiction of U.S. shipping. The second was the impressment of uh, um, Americans from into the British Navy. And the third was this delusional idea that Alicia really wanted to be part of the United States, and that Alicia's you know uh, ancestors
They
were
weren't here yet.
were just aching to be annexed, um, and that there were a whole bunch of Ev's ancestors who were like babbling to each other in French, that what they really wanted was to be freed and to join a different English speaking, megaopoly that was going to prevent them from speaking French. And so I just want to say that 2 out of 3 is not bad. And the lesson that the Trump administration should be taking from the War of 1812 is one, freedom of navigation on the high seas. Uh, two, that's what we got at the Treaty of Ghent, which
You also got
happened,
an island.
yeah, which
There was
happened
one
before,
territorial loss
yeah,
from
which
Canada.
happened before the Treaty of Ghent happened before our big victory, which was kind of an afterthought at the Battle of New Orleans,
It doesn't
right?
count.
It doesn't count, right? But we got the freedom of navigation stuff. We got the end to impressment. We didn't get Canada, which is why Alicia has the mug and why Alicia gets to keep using the mug and keep taunting our president with the mug. And so the point is 2 out of 3 isn't bad if you choose the right two.
Yes,
And
funny
that is the
chat.
and that is the point on which Alicia and I can agree. Look, folks, we are not allowed to have fun anymore. Um, uh, you know, but you are watching Dog Shirt TV. It is a goddamn revolution in morning television. And one of the revolutionary features of it is that a distinguished professor will get up at 5 in the morning to listen to me and Alicia babble at each other about the War of 1812 because and only because Alicia chose that mug this morning. Kate Sweeny, welcome to the show. I'm sure you are regretting your choices already. Alicia, why don't you introduce our guest?
Wait, I just like to wrap this up because one, I am so happy that somebody called you Cliff Clavin in the chat. Like it feels that was warranted. There's also speculation that you only did that to see how far you could go before I snap. Three, by the way, the Battle of Ogdensburg did not go well for you guys. It happened 10 minutes down the road, and at the fort in Prescott, they walked over the ice and sacked you. It was great. And
Yeah,
they
yeah, no, no.
recreate this every year.
I am just defending the idea that 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 was part of the war, but there was also that naval thing where we actually did pretty well. And so, I'm just saying 2 out of 3. Um, and I'm trying to remind my administration that the taking of Canada was the part that we didn't win. That was the bad idea in the War of 1812. The rest of it, I'm still with us.
I don't know, it feels reminiscent to the negotiating tactics of now, but let's set that aside because I'm never going to be allowed back in your country at this rate. I'm going to introduce Dr. Sweeny. So today we have Dr. Kate Sweeny. As Ben mentioned, she's a professor of psychology and the associate dean for graduate academic affairs at the University of California, Riverside. Is that the same as Irvine? I'm not sure because I'm not American.
No,
That's what I thought.
same time, not same time zone, different city.
And the reason why we've sucked her in at this horrible hour is because of her research focus, which has been looking at over the past couple of decades the stressful experience of awaiting for important news. So, Kate is an expert in uncertainty, and that's something I think we've all been suffering with lately. So, without further ado, can you tell us a little bit more about your research and how you got here and why this was of interest to you? Not the show, uncertainty.
Sure. Thank you so much for having me. I don't know how on earth to follow that lengthy introduction, but I will do my best. Yeah, so I am a social psychology researcher at University of California, Riverside. And my research has been, exactly as you said, for the last 20 plus years, studying how we wait. And so that involves looking at lots of really stressful waiting periods where we're waiting for different kinds of news, waiting for exam results, biopsy results, etc. And then in recent years and moving forward, I've started focusing on the more mundane waits, how we exercise patience in the face of lots of different kinds of delays in our life.
So the uncertainty of will they invade us or not feels like it's another research topic.
Right. Just for example.
I mean, it's a limited N experiment. I, there aren't that many. Well, I guess if you think about it as like individual Canadians waiting to be invaded, then it's you
Yes.
can get the N up to 35 million or something.
Yes, I should design the study right now.
We can help. How did you get into this area? Why were you attracted to looking at uncertainty?
Yeah, so it started really small in some ways, as many PhD studies do. I was interested in, well, what my PhD advisor was interested in, which was how we manage our expectations while we're waiting for different kinds of news. So, for example, he had done a study a couple years before I got to graduate school where he looked at students anticipating a midterm exam result and found this really predictable pattern. I don't know which order this is going to go in. Kind of looked like that, or which side I'm going from. But basically, the idea is students were wildly optimistic about their eventual midterm exam performance at the start of the semester. The day of the exam and shortly after the exam, they were pretty realistic. And then as they got to that moment of truth, exam is being handed back right in front of them, they suddenly became very pessimistic. And he dubbed that phenomenon bracing for the worst. And the idea is basically
And
that
is
we
what
can.
Alicia's doing with the whole, invasion thing. She was
I mean,
realistic about it
at
3
least
months
you're
ago.
prepared. Yeah, that's right. So it does, it does some good things. It doesn't feel very good to assume the worst in terms of invasion or failing a midterm. But it does, it turns out, prepare us for the worst. So we don't feel as bad if the worst comes. We feel better if good news arrives. So I started my graduate studies looking at that very narrow idea and just all the various things that make us brace more or less. And then over the years, I kind of widened that view out to thinking about waiting more generally. And psychology, weirdly, had kind of ignored this experience. I think I would hazard a guess that everyone listening can think of a time, if not right now, when they've been waiting for some kind of really stressful news. I mean, we've studied elections. That's pretty much everyone then. And psychology just sort of said, we know a lot about stress and coping. It's probably the same thing. But I think it's really unique. I mean, people really, really struggle with this waiting experience. And so I wanted to know why and how to make it easier. And so that's what I've been doing for the last 10 or 15 years, especially.
How do you make it easier?
Yeah, well, I can't make it easy. I shouldn't overpromise. I can say in my own life, I've had lots of even recent waiting periods. I have family in Florida. I live in the land of fires now, so if nothing else, natural disasters test my mettle in terms of waiting pretty regularly. But there are some things you can do. One is you can, frankly, just take your mind off of the waiting. Oftentimes, that's the best option we have. We have no control. We're very uncertain. That creates a lot of worry. Worry can be incredibly disruptive, disrupts sleep, disrupts concentration, makes us irritable. It's generally speaking not great to have around for very long. And so we've studied, just as one example, something called flow, the idea that we can get really, really into some kind of activity such that our mind just kind of quiets and time flies by. It's a temporary fix, but it's a pretty good one in the meantime. So that's one example. We can also kind of think differently about the news, maybe think of all the good things that would happen if, we invaded Canada. I think that's a stretch probably, but in theory, we have studied that idea.
Alicia
And maybe
regards
it's,
that as a null set.
yeah, that's fair enough. I have to say, though, I will challenge that slightly. We have studied that phenomenon with women awaiting news about breast cancer, which I admit scale-wise different from, invasion, but pretty serious. And in our study, when we asked women at their biopsy appointment, can you see any good that might come from this? Any upside essentially to a cancer diagnosis? I'll let everyone pause to guess how many might have said yes. And then I will reveal that it was upwards of 75% of these women said, if I have breast cancer.
Draw a right side to a breast cancer diagnosis?
Yeah, exactly. And they articulated all these really beautiful bright sides. They would appreciate life and their family more. They could be a role model for their daughters. They'd get healthier, et cetera, et cetera. So,
wow.
Yeah, so that can be a really powerful tool as well.
Way higher than I would have expected and way more delusional.
I guess it helps, is what I can say. Yeah, it's adaptive for sure.
That's astonishing. All right. We interrupted you. Please go on.
Yeah, there's some other things in the toolbox. I will probably annoy at least half your listeners by saying that mindfulness is really helpful. I know everyone's getting tired of being told to meditate, but there's a reason that we researchers keep telling people to do that. It's a really powerful tool, especially I think during these kinds of time paralysis kind of moments where you're just stuck in time and you're waiting for something to happen. I think one of the real challenges there is this mental time travel that we get stuck in where, maybe we're ruminating about things we could have done differently to position ourselves better. And then, of course, worrying immensely about the future and how things might turn out. Mindfulness is a really good antidote to that. It kind of puts you in the moment that you're in and maybe, reminds you to have some perspective. Those are probably the most powerful tools we've found. There's a few others, but we're still working on the toolbox.
So your research has looked at shorter periods of time when people are waiting for something very specific. And I think this might be beyond what you've looked at, but I'm just curious if has there been much assessment of humans sitting in sustained periods of uncertainty where it may be compounded? And then kind of if yes, what happens to us? Are there bright sides?
Yeah, a little bit there have.
Entirely hypothetical question.
Of course.
It has no
certainly
relationship to, and to anything going on.
Current events of any sort. Yeah, no, certainly.
So John's brought up a war. I'll say this.
Yeah.
In every conflict that I've had to work in, something kicks in where I'm actually at the top of my game and I can do it for a fairly sustained period of time, much better than I've been reacting to the current circumstances.
Yeah. Well, there's a couple of reasons for that. I think I'll address the broader question of sustained uncertainty, actually, including during war, though I haven't studied it. Others have. But, in terms of your example, I think, one of the things that makes waiting so hard in these periods of, again, sort of paralysis so difficult is that you can't act. And so I suspect the kind of cases you're thinking about where that top of the game feeling happened, you were able to do something, to take some action. And even if that's incredibly stressful, it gives us the sense of empowerment. We humans are built better for that than we are for the sort of waiting around, not being sure what to do, not knowing what will happen next. In terms of that kind of waiting, even in these most extreme of circumstances, I've been working on a book proposal, which has caused me to read very widely. And so I've, unlikely for me, dug into some history and kind of how people have handled, in fact, periods of war during the Blitz, for example, and other really treacherous war times. And that first example I gave of a tool, which is finding that flow, finding something that just kind of absorbs your attention completely, is actually like you can find traces of that in the writings even further back than World War I and II, but certainly in those periods of time of people taking up knitting, for example, in the bunkers to try to just pass the time, frankly. So I think that's actually a tool that people have instinctively been using for a really long time. I would also think of COVID-19. I did one study on flow during the really early days of COVID, in fact, in China. So before, at least in the US, I won't speak for Canada, before we really had any idea what was coming for us, but things were really quite bad there. And there again, we found that people who were finding flow, if they were in quarantine, they were much better off kind of mentally than those who were not finding that kind of flow. So I think, yeah, I mean, it's, not a perfect tool, but it's a pretty good one, even in these really challenging of circumstances.
Yeah, so I'm curious about uh, long waits versus short waits. So there are, you get a breast cancer biopsy and you're talking about waiting for 48
Week or
hours,
two. Yeah, right.
72 hours, 96 hours. Um, but an invasion could happen anytime, right? I mean, presumably there would be a buildup to it it's hard to invade a country without anybody noticing that you're, putting troops along the US Canadian border, say. But that can be a quite protracted period of time, and the thing that you're waiting for may never come. Whereas the results of the biopsy do show up. They could be good or they could be bad or they could be indeterminate, but you're going to get them, and you're going to get them at some known time. And I'm wondering if there are sort of different kinds of waiting that are deeply psychologically different depending on how long you wait and how certain you are that the wait has an end.
Yeah, the second of those two characteristics is, I think, the more important one. So we have looked at waits, I mean, as short as minutes in my lab, certainly when we contrive waiting situations. Those are harder to catch in the wild, but we can create them. And we've looked at waits as long as 4 months, for example. We've done a lot of studies with people taking the California bar exam to become lawyers in California. That is a fairly torturous 4 month waiting period. But in those kinds of examples, to your point, people know that the wait will end. And that's mostly the kind of waits that I have studied, because I'm kind of interested in the pattern of your psychological experience going from some, maybe mushy but somewhat definitive beginning of the wait to this moment of truth at the end. I do think what's much harder, regardless of the length, is the not knowing when it will end. We call those open-ended waiting periods. And people tend not to like them. So, for example, we did a study years ago where we surveyed people who were waiting for some kind of medical test result. For the most part, something fairly routine, but nonetheless, they were in that waiting period. And what we found is that about half of them, well, let me say this, about 95% said, my doctor just told me they'll let me know when the results are in. A very, very few of those patients said that my doctor gave me a date, like we'll come in, you'll come in next Friday and we'll have the results then. So most of them were in that kind of open-ended waiting period. And over half of the patients in that study said, I would rather wait longer, but no, like this is the day I'll find out. They wanted that structure. And so we've also studied a few waiting periods that are more of that kind of rolling, open-ended experience, nothing quite as severe as an invasion, but something like the academic job market, which is just kind of this iterative, torturous process of submitting applications, hearing nothing, submitting more, hearing nothing, and you have no idea when that will end. And I do think that's a harder psychological challenge in some ways. You can't kind of put it aside. One of the findings that's been really consistent in my research is when you know that that waiting period will end, we do kind of chill out in the middle, whether it's minutes, hours, days. We're kind of okay in the midst of the middle of that and much worse at the end of that waiting period. And you just don't have that predictability where you can kind of calm down and then ramp up your resources if you have no idea when the moment's coming. So I think those are probably more characterized by like a lot of vacillation. One day feeling fine, the next day feeling terrible, not quite knowing where to put your resources and when. So I think your instinct is right on that.
So I'm
It's almost like
curious.
double uncertainty.
Exactly, right. You don't know when and you don't know what, right?
So I'm curious about your election research. It seems to me there's three basic psychological strategies to waiting on elections. Um, one of them seems to me like the opposite of what you describe with the breast cancer, um, uh, which is instead of sort of looking at the bright side of your side losing, people really catastrophize their side losing, and um they dwell on the possibility that, the world could end, like the Flight 93 election, or or oh my God, Trump is going to end democracy, right? Some catastrophizing is frankly more plausible than others, but the instinct to catastrophize is very strong. The second is, which often takes place concurrent with the first, is denial, right? We're certain that so and so is going to win because uh, because everybody I know is voting for. We're so mobilized. We're getting reports of massive voter turnout in areas that we're excited about. And so you see the happy data points, and you um, and and you um, and I it seems to me those two instincts coexist very strongly in high stakes elections, that you, on the one hand, sort of prepare yourself and catastrophize, and on the other hand, are in total denial, and they exist at the same time. So what do we know about what's going on there psychologically?
Okay, so there's a few things to unpack there. One, I would say that your instinct about like this, so this thing I described where people say, yes, there's some good I might see in, for example, having breast cancer. I have called that preemptive benefit finding. That's fairly self-explanatory. We've also shortened it to predemption. The other is just a lot of syllables. But that idea of predemption, I think a lot of people do feel like there's no room for that, in an invasion of Canada. Frankly, I think, your instinct was there's no room for that with cancer. My studies showed otherwise. And just as an example, I was interviewed by, I think it was the Washington Post, within the week before this most recent US election. And I talked about this phenomenon as something people can do to feel a bit better. And I looked, you should never do this, but I did look at the initial comments on the piece when it came out, which were uncharacteristically kind. I didn't look any further past them. But those first few comments, like almost to a person, people were like, nope, absolutely not. There is nothing good I can see about my candidate losing. That will never happen. Don't try to make me. Having said that, we did this study in 2016 with Clinton and Trump, and found, in fact, that people did engage in this predemption in our studies. So Clinton supporters did, in fact, some of them at least, say, yes, I could see some good that might come of it if Trump was elected, and vice versa. And then we looked at how people felt after the election, and those Clinton supporters who had said, maybe not it will be good if Trump wins, but, on a 5-point scale, a 2 or a 3, there's something I can potentially see. They actually did better, kind of psychologically with their loss. They didn't take it as hard. So I think it is possible, even under the most treacherous of circumstances, and, including with a really high stakes election. So I guess I would just say, for some of us, it was hard. I think for others, they pulled it off, and those were probably the lucky ones if they were on the losing side. In terms of the denial, I mean, again, my pattern of findings suggests slightly otherwise to what you described. I think there certainly is a strong desire to look for those positive signs, in the moment, whatever that moment might be. But my research would strongly suggest, mine and others, that in those days leading up to the actual election day, on that election day, at least compared to the week before, the month before, the year before, people are not in denial. In fact, that's the moment at which people start to go, uh-oh, maybe my optimism was unfounded. Maybe I'm actually ignoring some polls that I should have been paying attention to. Uh-oh, that state doesn't look so good that I thought would be on our side. And so again, it's not to say that's universal, but that is the general pattern, is that we're feeling worse that day than any day prior to it.
That's so interesting. So then how do we explain the shock of 2016, or for Republicans, the shock of 2012, or the shock of 2024, where and for Republicans 2020, where you really, notwithstanding a lot of polling data that says, hey, this is going to be super close, you know, either side could win decisively. You really kind of, don't expect it. Like I always think of the opening line of Gravity's Rainbow, a screaming comes across the sky. It's happened before, but nothing prepares you for it. Right? Like, if people aren't in denial, what's the explanation for the degree of shock?
Yeah, I think it is one of the worst psychological experiences we can have, frankly, which is you brace for the worst, but you don't brace enough. So if you sort of think of a graph, let's say a Clinton supporter in 2016, I perhaps maybe one of those, was perhaps going from this, there's no chance that Trump gets elected to down, down, down to election day of like, I'm pretty sure he won't be elected. I very much remember that day. And then he is elected, and all of your bracing was for naught because you didn't brace enough. You didn't get pessimistic enough to prepare yourself. And many of us, myself included, have had that experience in smaller stakes events. Like you take an exam, you think, right, I didn't ace it, but I probably pulled off a B or a C, and then you absolutely failed, and it's almost the worst version of that. So I think that's just almost statistically, like on a graph, how I would explain that phenomenon. And the reason it's so psychologically damaging is because you think you've prepared yourself, and when you haven't, it's just you have to question everything about your ability to predict the future. So I think that was some of the shock there. I can't personally speak for Republicans in 2012, but I suspect it was something similar.
In general, it's pretty difficult for people if they've got competing or conflicting ideas running in their head too. Like that can't be a very comfortable situation, what Ben described for himself.
Yeah, that sort of like the denial plus the catastrophizing, you mean? Yeah, that's fair. I mean, I think that particular situation, I don't know, it's somewhere in the middle, right? So like everything will be terrible if we lose, but we're probably not going to lose is better than everything will be terrible if we lose, and we're definitely going to lose. So I think there was you probably got some buffer from the denial. I did too. I was really optimistic this time. Whoops. And so I can very much relate to that. But again, I think I knew people who were like, he's got this, and also it's going to be awful, and they were in worse shape leading up to the election than I was in my slightly protective bubble of I think we're going to win this one.
And who was in better shape after the election?
Yeah, well, so all things equal, I would say probably the ones who were prepared, but all things aren't equal, right? So those probably are also folks who are perhaps generally higher in those catastrophizing tendencies, generally higher in pessimism and neuroticism. And so, when all things aren't equal, they were probably miserable. Oh, is that ringing a bell for someone?
Oh, you see, I have this sunny disposition, and I have was relatively psychologically prepared for Trump's victory, um, and um, and Alicia
Oh, I'm
was
prepared for it. I predicted it in the first
was
time.
much more prepared, but is a dark soul, and is um let's just say does not have my sunny outlook on life, and it was plunged into the depths of despair from which she has not yet emerged.
Just call me Cassandra.
Fair. Well, I'm sort of half eyeing the chat. I'm probably missing a lot, but I just saw a person named Richard note that the 2024 election, I think for a lot of us, despite our passion being probably equally or more intense, didn't feel as bad as 2020 or 2016. I certainly experienced that. And again, I think within the context of my research, at least, that's fairly easy to explain. I can speak for myself and say my bracing went all the way to he totally could win. I mean, he's done it before. Whereas in 2016, it was like, no, there's no way. I guess it might be close. That will be annoying. I just I crossed the threshold this time, and I think most of us did because he's done it before. Of course he could win. And that just meant we were not, the shock was not nearly as intense, and that shock is pretty unpleasant.
What about the protracted waiting associated with unfolding events? So there is the Trump victory, the breast cancer diagnosis, the you failed the exam, the you know, we invaded Canada. Um, uh, there is also the 4 years of dismantling a federal government, of threatening to invade Canada, of, you know, saying crazy things on the international stage, of tariffs that may be imposed one day and removed the next day. And so you're constantly both in the mode of experiencing the bad event, relief from the bad event that didn't happen. So, we haven't invaded Canada. We did impose, but then removed the tariffs, right? Um, uh, what is the relationship between waiting and uncertainty in the context of a rapid fire cycle of bad events that do and don't happen over long periods of time?
Yeah, so I'm going to go beyond the data a bit here. I don't know that anyone has really studied that, but I can take some guesses. And I'm also living it, so I'll combine anecdote with data. I think a couple things. One is that sort of
We call that
constantly unfolding.
artisanal data.
Yes, brilliant artisanal data. So my artisanal data would suggest that sort of constant unfolding is essentially a chronic stressor because you never quite get your feet underneath you and can say, okay, I can do something about it. Also, in this particular case, I mean, precious few of us are in any position to do much at all of anything. So that lack of control is also, in its way, kind of a chronic stressor. Having said that, in many ways, we're all always waiting for lots of things. Like there's no point in life where everything is certain, obviously. And as one of my long ago grad students said, life is one long waiting period for all of us. We're all waiting for the end of it. So, there's some sense in which that's, I know, grim, but true. That might have been, the day before her dissertation defense. I don't remember, a particularly dark day. Um, but in any case, that's, certainly true. And the question is like, when does it feel like we're waiting? And again, I haven't had a chance to really tackle that question empirically, like with data, but my sense is that there are sort of characteristics that make a waiting experience pop out. And that is that it does become kind of focal. Like suddenly the piece of uncertainty that you are facing is now not like a buzzing background noise, but it is something that is stopping your life from moving forward. So for example, I'm not, fortunately, employed by the federal government, the National Park Service, et cetera, et cetera. Were I to be, this would probably feel like one of those really intense waiting periods that I study because they'd be waiting like for a specific piece of news that may be coming any day. I'm a bit protected from that for now, at least. And so for me, and I think for lots of people, it is that kind of buzzing, like you can't quite grab hold of any one of those bits of uncertainty. The news is just coming fast and furious. The bad news turns into good news any minute and then vice versa. And so I think, again, it acts more like that chronic stressor than this really predictable kind of intense waiting experience that I've studied for the most part.
There was a question in the chat Fred had asked earlier on about, is there any evidence? I feel like people might have anecdotal evidence on this one, but is there any evidence that people do better talking to others in facing uncertainty, or does that make it worse? And then a follow-on question to that, because kind of qualitatively it's a bit different, the impact of turning to social media.
Yeah, social media is always a complex stew of benefit and harm. Depends, I think, which social media also. So let me answer the first question first. So is there a benefit to talking to people? Maybe. It depends a lot on what the people say back, kind of how they support you. And that's a really complicated task, actually. So I had a graduate student, Mike Dooley, who was really interested in social support. And so we did do a number of studies looking at kind of how people tend to support others who are waiting, how we feel supported when we're waiting or not. And the unfortunate conclusion is, if you know someone who's in a really bad waiting period, there's no like formula, there's no recipe, the same exact kind of support behavior, giving advice, telling people to just forget about it or assume the best or assume the worst can feel great or terrible on any given day for a person who's waiting, and they may not even know, what they need. So I think that's really challenging, obviously, for the supporter and the person looking for support. But there's kind of a broader concept that I think is more achievable. And this is called perceived responsiveness in our in our field. But basically, the idea is it doesn't really matter a lot of times when you're supporting someone or when you're seeking support for that matter, what that person does or says. It's really whether you feel understood, cared for, and valued. And so again, it's not that that's a necessarily easy thing to do either, but I think, worry less as a supporter about what exactly you're saying and doing, and just kind of say, I hear you, I see you, this is hard, what do you need? And that's more likely to be successful. I will mention just one other quick thing, which is in these kind of fixed waiting periods that I study where you kind of know there's an end. We've found, for example, with the bar exam, romantic partners are really showing up for their partners at the beginning, right after the exam. It seems like almost everyone is talking to their, for example, romantic partner right after the big moment of the exam. And people are pretty good at supporting their partners in that moment. They're also pretty good at the very end, those final days, they're about to check and see if they passed. Thumbs up for supporters there. That middle period where sometimes it's still really hard, those romantic partners were not really showing up for the job. I think probably a lot of those conversations kind of went, I don't even know why you're thinking about it. You're not going to know for a few months, like stop worrying. And, that's not exactly successful. So complex answer to the what happens in talking to others. It can be good and bad. Social media, I would say, is probably good to the extent that you use it as a way to get support from people who will support you. So, more of a local version of social media. Obsessing, like doom scrolling, I think there's pretty compelling evidence that is never a good idea if your goal is mental health.
So I want to ask about a strategy, whether there's any research on a strategy that I use pretty constantly. I find that when I am stressed out about something, the most effective way to relieve anxiety on my own part about uncertainty is to counsel or help somebody who is more stressed out about it than I am. It's, like in these periods, I find, I counsel a lot of federal employees about how to handle their situations. A lot of people are looking for work. I try to help them find work. A lot of people need lawyers. I find them lawyers. And that there's something significantly therapeutic about both the recognition that this isn't about me, which being a narcissist, I do actually have to remind myself. I guess the difference between me and a true narcissist is I bother to remind myself. But I have those tendencies that this is really all about me, and if my role in it is not adequately understood, then something is going wrong. And so I both as a tonic to that narcissistic instinct on my own part, but also as a way of reminding, as a way of feeling like I am doing something, even when that is at the extreme micro level, the getting involved on other people's behalf, whether it's, projecting a Ukrainian flag on the Russian embassy, or whether it's reading somebody's book manuscript, is a really important just strategy. And I'm wondering if there's any research on like that as a strategy.
Yeah, it's a really good instinct that you're having, actually. I was kind of in my head building up all the ways in which that could be helpful as you were talking. One is just that doing nice things for other people, prosocial behavior, as we
really
say.
Makes you feel good.
Yeah, it makes you feel good. I mean, we are, fortunately, as humans, as social creatures, essentially wired to feel good when we help others. That really bothers some philosophers, that there's like no true altruism. It's always kind of about us. But how fortunate that we don't have to like overcome misery to help someone else. It's actually beneficial to us to do so in some very basic ways. So you're kind of getting that hit of positivity. you also picked up on something, which is that you get to do something, which is, the kind of the antidote to that powerlessness that waiting and uncertainty so often creates. And so just by acting in some way where you feel like you can kind of spend that agitation that many of us feel in those moments, that's a good thing as well. And to the extent when you first started describing that, I thought you might mean something like, your partner or friend is really, really freaking out about the, say, election, where you're kind of medium freaking out. I think I found that happening sometimes before this most recent election. Like my husband would have a particularly bad, pessimistic day when I was feeling okay. And I think sometimes sort of just saying to someone else, like, no, 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 I think it's actually going to be okay. Like you hear yourself saying that. So that's also kind of another positive feedback loop, I guess. But I think the more important factors are really helping others feels good and doing something feels good.
Interesting.
Yeah.
Richard, you have a question, but you're muted.
You're muted.
Can you hear me now?
We can.
Good. So I have a question that's sort of I guess there are two. Well, wait, let me ask the question and then the two ways to maybe approach it. So all these things that you're talking about with waiting, it strikes me that we have a different relationship to time as a society than people did 300 years ago or so, and possibly, and I guess from anthropological perspective, maybe what we call primitive tribes out of in the Amazon or wherever, probably also have a different experience. I'm just wondering, what do we, what does it look like where the place of waiting in society is just not the same? Do we know much about that? Or does it still look a lot like it? I mean, we expect elections every 2, 4 years. We can go to a doctor and get a diagnosis and wait for that. So we do a lot of waiting because we can find out a lot about the future. What happens when you take that away?
Yeah, I love this question. And I think some of your instincts on this are really good. So, as a general answer, I tend to think that things have not changed as much as we might think. This was kind of embedded in your question a little bit, but, the length of time we might have to wait for something changes constantly. Whether it takes 48 hours to get a biopsy result or, a month has changed even in the last, let's say, 25 years. Maybe that, diagnosis was going to take, I don't know, months or years in some previous time. But ultimately, I think the thing that matters most psychologically is how long we expect something to take and how long it actually takes. So, that whole thing may have gotten crunched down in a lot of ways as technology has allowed for quicker answers. But if we expect something to happen in 1 minute and it takes 5, that feels just as bad as if someone in some earlier time had thought it would take a week and it takes 5 weeks. So I think it's not that waiting has gotten easier or harder necessarily. It's just that we expect things to happen faster. And if they don't happen in that time frame, that's more uncomfortable. So our standards are sort of higher. You also picked up on a cultural difference that's kind of interesting. And I don't know much about whether this has changed over time, but certainly across different cultures, even currently, there are different kinds of relationships with time. The most interesting to me, I guess, of those differences is that there are places like the US, I suspect like Canada, where we're kind of on clock time. So, if you're going to gather with people, it happens at 8, and if you're not there at 8, you're late. There are other places in the world where there's something they think of as event time, which is like the party starts when everyone's there. It doesn't really matter what the time is. And I don't quite have anything except wild guesses as to how that might change our experience of waiting, except I suspect we clock time people are probably a little worse at it because we have those really fixed expectations about when things should happen. And if it doesn't happen, then that violates our expectations and that feels bad. So that doesn't fully address your question, but those are my initial thoughts.
Yeah, I guess one of the things that strikes me though is that is it true that we do a lot more waiting and at a lot of different scales? We wait on a, daily, weekly, monthly, yearly, even greater spans than that. Uh, what happens when when your life doesn't, our lives revolve around waiting. in some respects. What happens when you take that away? Do we know?
Oh, that's interesting. So sort of a hypothetical where we don't have to wait. That's a really interesting question.
And
My only
that's
initial
why I
kind of,
brought up. Oh,
yeah.
that's
No,
why I
go ahead,
brought up
please.
that's why I brought up the anthropological
Yeah.
perspective, because that might be one place where you can look to answer that question.
No, but I don't. I want to reject the premise of the question. The more technologically advanced we get, the more waiting we do. Not we're not going to have the app device that takes away waiting.
Oh,
Also,
right,
the
right.
more
No, I
impatient we
agree.
become.
Oh,
Yes.
so you
So I
you
would say,
mean what
right.
happens if you look back and say, let the Yanomamo spend a lot less time waiting than we do. Are they less stressed?
Mhm.
Yes, and I mean, what does that do to their entire life, where they're not, their life does not revolve around waiting the way ours,
Yeah.
or maybe it doesn't. The intensity of it isn't as great as it is for us,
Mhm.
perhaps.
Yeah, I think your instinct is right. Like that has to be easier. Again, I have no data to speak to this, but as I said earlier, I mean, that constant sense of anticipation, uncertainty, and waiting it can act kind of like a chronic stressor. And so to the extent that that is absent, that you more like live in the moment, essentially, every bit of evidence I can think of would suggest you'd be better off, psychologically speaking, all other things being equal, which they tend not to be.
Right, like
Well,
that you live much
somebody.
less long and therefore spend a higher percentage of your life, um, uh, getting ready to die at 45, right?
Yeah.
I'm a little bit skeptical of the Rousseauian romanticization of the hunter-gatherer, Richard.
Uh, okay, uh, I'll leave it at that. So,
You're a great American, sir.
thank.
Richard and I spent an evening um, projecting "Get Out the Vote" messages on the Philadelphia 30th Street train station,
So
and in one of those ramp up to, um, you know, the waiting for the event. And we're shocked to find that this did not sway enough Pennsylvania voters to make a difference. Um, Sorry, Alicia, the floor is yours.
No, I mean, I guess one thing after listening to Richard's question too is my guess is that it wouldn't really be possible for the likes of us who grew up in a culture where waiting is very much a part of our lives, and some of us are even less patient at the waiting, would ever really be able to like grasp after being this way. Like, could we even be in a different timeline where waiting doesn't happen or isn't a thing for us? Like, we can't really unprogram ourselves that far, can we?
I think your best shot would be, frankly, again, annoying recommendation, but a whole lot of mindfulness meditation. Because again, I think, when you say, and when Richard said, like, we spend a lot of time waiting, I think what we mean by that, like, again, the folks back in time, different countries, tribal, whatever, everyone's waiting. I mean, you're always waiting for stuff. But the question is, are you thinking about your waiting? Are you focused on the fact that things are uncertain? And, the best way to undo that is essentially to live as much in the present moment as possible. So, not to glorify the mental health necessarily of monks or whatever, but I do suspect that those who spend, hours and hours a day in mindfulness practice aren't thinking about what comes next tomorrow nearly as much as most of us are. So I think that's the only shot you'd have. But I think you're right that for most of us, that's probably out of reach. Yes.
Too much present would lead me to make really poor decisions, not thinking about the future.
Yeah, that is often a complaint about mindfulness. I think, in actual practice, it sort of allows you to think about the future without getting wrapped up in your worry about the future. Not to, again, glorify mindfulness too much, but it has been very effective for me. So, you can kind of think like, oh, I'm noticing that I'm worried about this thing. Okay, that might tell me I should do something about it. let it go. So that, I mean, that sort of practice can be really useful. Again, that's a easier said than done kind of tip.
It's something that I mean I've been advocating for just even in terms of people's online lives, right? Like
Yeah. Yeah.
the whole response mechanism of seeing something on the internet and feeling like you have to respond or have any kind of reaction suggests that
Yep.
like there is only kind of one path forward for
Yeah.
humans other than disconnecting.
Yeah. Yeah. I think that's right. That sort of compulsive reactivity is not good for us.
Yeah, I mean, I think about that a lot because, you know, when I when I came up through journalism, which was right at the beginning of the internet age, we had one opportunity to talk a day. And the readers had none. I mean, the early ones were had Usenet boards or whatever, but like the average reader had no opportunity to react in public short of, you know, writing a sign and carrying it to the White House, right, and holding up the sign. Your opportunities to make an ass of yourself by talking in public about a subject you don't know anything about were basically zero, at least if the if the making an ass of yourself required anybody hearing you. Um, I mean, you could go stand on a soapbox, but likelihood would be nobody would notice and nobody would care. And by the way, nobody would video it and post it to social media. Now, you know, my opportunities to react to things are astonishingly frequent and like 1,000 times a day. And people's opportunities to respond to me are exponentially greater than that because every time I respond to something, you know, 200,000 people on Blue Sky have the opportunity to respond to me. And you just think about the number of choices that we collectively are experiencing about how often to say something in public. This gets into Alicia's field of an information ecosystem, but just the number of choices that face me every day and face the world about me, about how much interaction to do, and then each one of those involves a tiny little bit of waiting and stress. And you amalgamate that waiting and stress over hundreds and hundreds of thousands of interactions or potential interactions per day. And it just can't be good for you. You know, like I don't want to try to say anything grand or important about it. It just doesn't seem like a good idea, particularly if you're like a 15-year-old.
Yeah, I mean, I think the evidence is in your favor on that front. I tend to, personally, my instinct is to, let me put it this way. I find it more interesting to think about what was similar than what was different because I think the differences between now and, I don't know, pick your time, 100, 300 years ago are really obvious. But, I also wonder if, I mean, your point is well taken. There's a big difference between the kind of massive social exposure we have and what life might have looked like 100 years ago. But I don't know that it's necessarily fair to assume that, the small social interactions people had walking through their day didn't create the same kinds of decision-making stress that we have now. It just happens with strangers on the internet instead of the local butcher, baker, produce salesman. But I wonder if it was so different. I think sometimes we exaggerate the ways in which our psychology has changed because the sort of evident way that we're interacting with each other has changed.
Parents would have gone into town once a week. So it would have been
Yeah.
like a really localized experience. Like they deal with their friends that live near them, their neighbors, their family, and then every Saturday or Sunday they would head into the nearest town. It feels like it would be less interaction.
Yeah, that's probably true. Maybe every interaction means more as a result of that. And, the small town nature of that sort of interaction means every choice you make is heavier because, your town turns against you, you're in real trouble, right? The internet turns against you, or some corner of the internet that you're blue
Right.
skying on, again, I don't mean to say that there are no differences. I think I fear sometimes we exaggerate them in a way that, I don't know, makes us feel very special and unique, and maybe things weren't quite so different as we think.
We are out of time because here at Dog Shirt Daily, we begin on time, we end on time. Folks, it is now 6 o'clock in the morning for Kate, and I hope she's going back to bed. Um, and thank you so much for getting up in an ungodly hour and joining us. We hope the waiting for this event was not stressful, and that the experience of it once it occurred was uh, exceeded your expectations and therefore filled you with an appropriate range of whatever pleasure hormones a live stream can endorphins a live stream can provide. Folks, we're going to be back tomorrow. I got no idea who the guest is.
I can tell you, you're back on
Alicia knows
Africa.
exactly who the guest is.
It's Rick Ehrenreich, and you're looking at how do you solve a problem like Kagami. So I'm guessing Rwanda, DRC, and then you also have North Korea and Ukraine the day after. So
Yeah, so we've got bad guys, or as Trump calls them, bad hombres, and we're going to talk about North Koreans in Ukraine or in Russia. And we're going to talk about Paul Kagame, bad guy, um, and you're going to have to wait for that. You're going to have to wait 23 hours, 22 hours and 59 minutes. But I'm going to tell you, it's going to be okay because at the moment, at 8 o'clock a.m. tomorrow morning, I'm going to hit that go live button. It's going to count down from 5, and I'm going to do a monologue on some subject that may or may not depend on what mug Alicia is
oh, I
wielding.
won't be here tomorrow, but I'll be back on Thursday.
Well, it may depend on what mug Holly is wielding. Uh, Folks, keep the faith and do good stuff for other people. It really does make you feel good.